As a consumer, does demand for ethical products have power on the decisions made in supply chains? By Charlotte, Jake, Adam, Bernadette and Gemma. Content of the presentation will include ethical products and ethical consumers, triple bottom line, theories of power balance and ethical supply chains, power of the consumer, power of the organisation, and the question of whether does the consumer always care, including our personal experiences and a brief conclusion. Ethical products refer to a whole set of issues and considerations whilst going through the supply chain. The main three are the environment, animal rights/welfare, and human rights. As a consumer, you can display self-accountability if you buy ethical products, this meaning you are taking into consideration the main three factors and are purchasing good and guilt-free products. Crane stated that ethical consumption can be a powerful tool for change, and now if we look at this 15 years later, ethical consumption is more thought of and considered.
The triple bottom line was developed as corporations and governments transitioned to sustainable development. Historically, most businesses were only interested in their finances and profits. However, this model shows that businesses should also be interested in social and environmental issues. However, there are some issues with the triple bottom line. There is a disagreement over whether each pillar should be considered as equally important. Also, there are questions around how all three can work together, considering they seem to be conflicting. For example, some business practices that are beneficial for the environment then reduce profits for the business.
To focus on a single goal of collaboration is unrealistic. This may deprive companies of many valuable benefits that can be derived from other levels of supply chain integration. Service to end customer can be driven to even higher standards by focusing the whole supply chain on that goal, rather than diluting the efforts of individual companies through conflicting objectives. Companies that have succeeded in integrating supply chains have achieved breakthrough improvements. For example, in the clothing industry, sales have increased by 20% and reduced markdowns by 33%. If there is an atmosphere of suspicion from previous behaviour, many will hold back. Consequently, these companies are faced with the challenge of continuing to find revenue, cost and service improvements based on internal actions alone. This is not a route for achieving the required levels of competitiveness. So, there is clearly a need for an improved understanding of the relationships between customer and supplier. The use and abuse of power plays a key role when integrating supply chains. Companies need to recognise that the relationship will be driven by the relative power and interdependence of the parties involved. Therefore, organisations must understand their position in the supply chain, and each must be in the position to maximise benefits in the context of the whole chain. There is no single one-size-fits-all solution for all customers or suppliers. Types of supplier relationships. Firstly, arm's length. The supplier base here is multiple sourcing, and the methods are competitive tendering and spot buying. Cooperative. There are fewer suppliers, and the methods are negotiation and preferred suppliers with agreements. And finally, collaborative. There is possible of single sourcing and joint working towards continuous improvements. The matrix shows a position between buyers and sellers, or suppliers and customers. In the leverage section, the supplier is dependent on the buyer, the customer has the power, and the buyer is the master to a servant seller. In the critical section, which is also known as the strategic section, all three are interdependent of each other. In the routine section, the supplier is the trader, the customer is the trades, and the buyer is trading. In the bottleneck section, the supplier has the power, the customer is dependent on the seller, and the buyer is the slave to the seller.
Now we will look at the rise of consumer power using the push-pull strategy. On this slide, we will talk about push. As you can see, some of the logos, Virgin Trains, Nestle, Tesco, and RBS. We will talk about these in the next slide as well. When researching about consumer power, Deloitte mentioned the push-pull strategy. In the past, information was rarely made available to customers like it is today. Instead, the companies would only push certain bits of information towards the customer. As technological advances have occurred, it was noted that customers tend not to have information pushed in front of them anymore, and in turn preferred to use the pull method. Now we will look at the pull strategy. As you can see from the slides, I have incorporated different logos: Google, Facebook, Twitter and BBC. The pull method is more commonly seen today with the rise in social media and the availability of information through the internet. Consumers can quickly access information on websites about any organisation using search engines such as Google. From my own experience, I believe companies wish to engage more with customers. Virgin, for example, have both Facebook and Twitter accounts. I often see various customers asking for train times or information about their services. As bad news travels fast, consumers can also voice their opinions using social media platforms. I have sometimes often done this to get a quick response from the companies, as many do not like negative comments or tweets on their sites or social media.
Fair trade is often used as an example of how consumer demand for ethical products has been influential. Fair trade was developed as a response to the failure of conventional trade to deliver sustainable livelihood and development opportunities to people in the poorest countries of the world. Consumers, NGOs, the media, and social and environmental pressure groups used lobbying, protests, and boycotts to put pressure on companies to treat producers in developing countries fairly. This was a result of better informed consumers who are increasingly interested in working conditions and corporate social responsibility, and led to demands for companies to be held accountable for their whole supply chain in order to maintain a good public image. The brand claim that with fair trade you have the power to change the world every day emphasises their view that consumer demand for ethical products has the power to change decisions made in the supply chains. In 2009, Cadbury became the first mainstream chocolate brand to become Fair Trade certified and tripled sales for farmers, which has resulted in over 21 schools, 2 healthcare clinics, and 23,000 people in Ghana benefiting from solar panels and lanterns. Cadbury stated that although they could have reduced prices for consumers, they chose to become fair trade and pay their suppliers more because that is what the consumers wanted. In my personal experience, I buy Cadbury because it's my favourite chocolate and am more likely to keep buying their products because they are fair trade. However, I don't necessarily seek out fair trade products and think it would be beneficial for all companies to have to meet some sort of standards such as fair trade to be allowed to be sold in UK shops in order to take the decision away from the consumer. Personally, I would prefer to buy fair trade or ethical products, but don't always think about it while shopping. Continuing with the fair trade and Cadbury's example, although it might seem that Cadbury have joined up to fair trade because it's the morally responsible and ethical thing to do, brings benefits to those further down the supply chain, and is what the consumers have demanded, there may be other reasons behind the decision. Firstly, Cadbury needs their farmers in order to be able to make and sell their products. By paying a wage that is unsustainable for the farmers, they would jeopardise their own future. Therefore, by becoming fair trade and paying a price that enables a sustainable life for the farmers, they are also securing their own future. Secondly, they can also use this as a marketing tool to promote their brand and sell to an ethically conscious market. Therefore, although the consumers do seem to have been powerful and influential in fair trade, ensuring that ethical products are sold, there may have also been other considerations which we will discuss further.
Some organisations have begun to hire independent auditors to monitor their supply chain. However, there are issues with this. Pre-announced audits enable producers to falsify records and rid facilities of unauthorised agency contractors or exploited workers during audits. Corporations control how deep the auditors are allowed to go into their supply chains. Many organisations only audit Tier 1 suppliers, where the final assembly of products takes place. It can be suggested that auditors have worsened conditions for workers by shifting the problems further down the supply chain. US clothing company REI stated that it had audited a percentage of the Tier 1 factories in its supply chain, but this only amounted to 27% of its total global supply chain. Fair trade can also come under scrutiny from this auditing process. For example, in the coffee industry, farmers will be checked to see if they are correctly paid, but no one then asks the pickers if the farmers are paying them. It is also claimed that there is a strong divide between social and environmental issues in the audits. Therefore, it allows the organisations to claim that they have improved one of the issues, usually environmental, whilst ignoring the other. Now we're going to discuss the power of the government. Evidence of the role of legislation on ethical decisions made in the supply chain. There are laws in place such as the Modern Slavery Act 2015. It is constituted by the offences of slavery, servitude, and forced or compulsory labour and human trafficking. Certain organisations are required to provide a statement providing information on how they have made sure that no slavery exists in their organisation or supply chain. Failure to produce this statement can result in an unlimited fine. Making laws to prevent unethical practices in their supply chain is the way to go, because it doesn't allow businesses to simply ignore the problem in their supply chains. Right, we're now going to talk about some examples of companies that have had ethical issues in their supply chains. In 2001, it was reported that a large amount of the cocoa Nestlé used came from farms in the Ivory Coast. Farms that weren't monitored by the government, they are said to have kept over 600,000 children in horrendous conditions. Even when Nestlé's supply chain practices were discovered in 2001, they still didn't stop. In fact, it took until 2012 and an internal audit survey to stop Nestlé. The survey included information such as children having machete wounds and entire families being forced to work without pay. Nestlé has since pledged to eradicate child labour. So why now? Is it a case of we better change because we've been caught? Has Nestlé been affected by the scandal? Well, no, not really. Nestlé's profits were up by 44.6% in 2014 to $15.4 billion. The child labour scandal doesn't seem to have affected Nestlé at all. Nike has also had supply chain issues, with workers at their Sukabumi plant claiming that supervisors threw shoes at them, kicked them, slapped them and called them dogs and pigs. Nike simply claims that the abuse may well happen, but it is done by their contractors and that they simply can do little to stop it happening. Has Nike been affected by these issues? Once again, not really. Nike were quite dismissive of the reports and claimed that it wasn't down to them, but surely if they are hiring the contractors, the power is with them. Nike reported a 20% year-on-year rise in net profit for the 3 months ending November 2015, showing us that the demand for their products has not been affected by the ethical issues in their supply chain. Right, so now I'm going to talk about my personal experience with these brands. I would still buy both these brands, with them being so big they are difficult to avoid. Doing this research has opened my eyes to the ethical issues in their supply chains. However, with the issues being so far away, it is almost a case of out of sight, out of mind. And more definitely needs to be done to eradicate them in the future.
As you can see from the video, Apple have been under scrutiny for a while now, but a certain case in 2013 revealed that conditions for 70,000 workers at the Pegatron plant were allegedly worse than those reported in the Foxconn scandal. Apple have broken 86 laws, and those include long working hours, poor pay of 98 pence an hour. As a consumer myself, I own Apple products, and knowing of such a scandal doesn't come into my head when I purchase products. I own an iPad and an iPhone, and I chose to buy these because they fit my needs as a consumer. However, now looking at it, it may look like that I support the mistreatment of employees, but I just think it's a case of out of sight, out of mind. I don't know what's going on there, and I'm just purchasing the end product. Also, what is interesting to look at is the fact that Apple is such a well-known brand in this industry of technology that even when reports like the Foxconn scandal and the Pegatron scandal come out, that sales do not decrease. They, in fact, increase when the product is launched. So the fact that the consumer has power here, I would say they don't have power, and that the organisation has full power over the consumer. Also, a very controversial point to look at is in factories such as the Foxconn scandal and the Pegatron plant, is a job better than no job for the factory workers? Because even if they didn't work in these factories, it's better to have a job and have an income. They'd be further in poverty than what they are now. A very controversial point to make, but it is a case of they'd be in further poverty. I think in the case of Apple, where the consumer doesn't have any power and the organisation has the most power, they should respond to the media of the problems in these plants and offer better pay to workers, just to reassure the consumer that they are doing the right things. Even if their sales aren't affected by the media portraying them in this way, they should still do what is morally right.
So how to monitor ethical issues? Some organisations now see being ethical as a way of differentiating themselves from their competition. This is good news, as it means that they will monitor their own supply chain's ethical issues. For example, Apple have recently been gaining bad publicity for bad practices in the supply chain in the Far East. Apple's CEO Tim Cook has announced that an independent body will look into the claims made and allow Apple to rid themselves of any ethical issues. This is an important move for the future of ethical supply chain management because if a successful company such as Apple is concerned about supply chain policies affecting its brand image, then other organisations will be as well.
Does the consumer always care? Evidence that consumers don't always make the choice to buy ethical products. If we take a look at the milk price dispute, it is a well-known fact that we pay less for 4 pints of milk than we do for a bottle of water. Dairy income for farmers in the last 5 years has decreased by 45%. When looking at the question, as a consumer, does demand for ethical products have power on the supply chain? The answer in this case is no. We as a consumer have high demand for milk because it is a necessity in nearly every household. So if our demand for ethical products can affect decisions made in the supply chain, such as how much farmers are paid per litre, if we as a consumer know that how farmers are treated is unethical as they are making a loss of at least 7 pence per litre on milk, why do we choose to buy milk from supermarkets than our local farmers, which will deliver? I think the main point here is to make that the top 4, Morrisons, Tesco and Asda and Sainsbury's, sell milk for less than £1 for 4 pints of milk. We all know that we can't get that delivered from our farmer to our door for cheaper than that. So is it a case of we want to be ethical consumers, but we don't want to pay the price to be an ethical consumer?
Do consumers really have power? The rise of a horse meat scandal, which rose through the media, which when passed through social media platforms caused Tesco's share prices to plummet. From my own experience of working for Tesco's, they had tried to change the image of the company by asking consumers for feedback, and now promote where their products come from. But yet, the share prices have still not recovered to this day. Sandeep 2006 writes, "What we are seeing today is a renegotiation of relationships between companies and consumers and a fundamental recasting of conventional marketing in favour of the consumer." Do I believe consumers have power? On their own, no. As a group, yes. But consumers must play their part too. Consumers must want to pay extra for ethical products. They have to care enough that if an organisation does not supply ethical products, they could lose customers and their money. But consumers must also follow through on their demands. The media plays a very important aspect too, in the fact of what they broadcast. And the government need to legislate and provide pressure for organisations to provide ethical products. This in turn may lead to more consumer power and organisations being more regulated.
The debate to whether consumers really have power or not depends on a number of factors. The unity and like-mindedness of the consumer, willingness and ability to pay more. Consumers must be willing to boycott or boycott a product if it is unethical or ethical. It depends on the knowledge and transparency which can be enhanced by the media. And finally, government legislation which provides pressure for organisations to provide ethical products.
Downstream organisations and customers appear to have very little knowledge of products as they are only exposed to the final product, not the supply chain that has produced it. For example, in my experience of hearing about the horse meat scandal, consumers, including myself, were shocked at the lack of knowledge supermarkets had about their products, meaning that customers of the supermarkets had even less knowledge. However, new guidelines are now set out for companies to regulate where certain items are made and to increase their awareness. Furthermore, consumers are becoming increasingly interested in seeking information out about products, such as seeing and sharing information on social media or demanding it from companies. However, for those less proactive about gaining information, they may still have little and potentially biased knowledge.
Firstly, buyer dominance does apply to my experience as a consumer because, particularly at the end of a season, there are few buyers for products and many sellers, so sales tend to occur, showing that buyers have power by reducing the cost of products because there isn't many of them. Secondly, I have seen interdependence occur, particularly in niche products like high-quality grand pianos or other handmade instruments. There are few suppliers and few buyers. Thirdly, I have seen supply dominance, particularly in differentiated products, such as the iPhone. There are many buyers and only one supplier, Apple. The supplier has other alternatives of revenue like the iPad and other products. Due to this dominance, I have also seen a price premium. Lastly, independence. Unfortunately, I have not experienced many buyers and many suppliers as a customer.